Greetings from Warsaw, and good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening, wherever you are. My name is Kishan Manocha, and I am the head of the Tolerance and Non-Discrimination Department at the OSCE Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, or ODIHR. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to this Commission on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice, CCCPJ, side event on addressing hate crimes after Kyoto, which is organized jointly by ODIHR and UNODC. As many of you may know, ODIHR has been in the forefront of working on addressing hate crimes ever since the 57 OSCE participating states agreed back in 2003 on the first ever set of political commitments to address this phenomenon. As you also know, most probably, the OSCE is a security organization. Its concept of security is multidimensional. It has, in that regard, or places, I should say, in that regard, equal emphasis on the political and military dimension of security, the economic and environmental dimension of security, and the human dimension of security. And its work on hate crimes, tolerance, and non-discrimination more broadly falls within, of course, that particular pillar. And the OSCE therefore views hate crimes or crimes committed with a biased motive as therefore not just a threat only to human dignity and the equality of individuals, but also social cohesion and security, not just within countries, but among and between them and within the region itself. And ODIHR's mandate is to monitor the hate crime situation in the region and to work to support OSCE participating states and civil society in their efforts to address hate crimes through tailored capacity building and other programs and assistance. I don't think I need to introduce the role of UNODC, which is the main UN body tasked with work in the field of criminal justice and crime prevention. And we are delighted to be partners today with our friends at UNODC on this side event. So thank you all very much for your support and assistance in this process. As you know, we're in the middle of the 30th session of the CCPCJ, and one of the issues that the Commission is considering currently, of course, is the Kyoto Declaration, which was agreed to at the recent Kyoto Crime Congress some weeks ago. Now, the declaration includes strong, powerful, and important language on hate crimes, particularly paragraph 91, in which it asks UN member states to, and I quote, develop effective strategies, including by enhancing the capacity of criminal justice professionals to prevent, investigate, and prosecute hate crimes, as well as engage effectively with victims and victim communities to build public trust when engaging with law enforcement to report such crimes. This is the first time that such robust commitments on hate crimes have been put forward in the UN system. It is indeed historic and most welcome. And in that spirit, ODIHR looks forward to the next steps in elaborating what is in the declaration as UN member states and the UN system seeks to strengthen the important international framework for addressing hate crimes. So that is the context to this side event today, and we hope this event will achieve at least two things. One, provide further food for thought to UN member states as they discuss ways forward at this meeting of the CCPCJ, and two, to explore how the hate crime landscape has changed as a result of Kyoto, and what this means for the OSCE and ODIHR, for UNODC, and for all of you in the audience. And we will explore what UN member states can and should do to develop these effective strategies as stated in the Kyoto Declaration, effective strategies, I should say, against hate crimes, and the implications of that very important call. This is a short event. We will hear from a number of distinguished speakers and experts. And before we have the panel discussion, we will hear from two colleagues. First, our dear friend and colleague, Anna Giudice, who is the Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice Officer for UNODC, who will offer some reflections about the meaning of Kyoto and the potential for UNODC's work on addressing hate crimes. And then my colleague, Alish Gao-Hanek, who is the hate crime officer, one of the 2 hate crime officers at ODIHR, who will then introduce ODIHR's own experience with, if you like, giving life and expression to OSCE's political commitments on hate crime. And following this, we will have an expert panel speaking about national initiatives. My colleague, Yulia Kolisheva, who is ODIHR's assistant program officer, will moderate this section, and we will hear from 3 distinguished panelists: Kathleen Coogan from the US Department of State, Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs, from Paul Giannassi, UK's Police Hate Crime Advisor, and from Robin Sclafani, who is Director of SEGI, a Jewish contribution to an inclusive Europe. There will be time, I should say it'll be limited time, unfortunately, for questions and reflections from all of you. Please post these questions throughout the event using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We will then select from among those questions and comments a number that we will do our best to address. I should let you know that we are recording this event. And with this introduction, I wish us all a very fruitful and productive meeting, and now hand over to Anna. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Kishan, and thank you so much to all dear colleagues for co-organizing this event with us. I'm going to use a small and short presentation because I don't have many minutes to present some ideas of what we can and could do to implement the Kyoto Declaration. So as was mentioned, my name is Anna Giudice. I work in the justice section in UNODC, and our mandate is to assist member states in implementing, using and applying the UN standards and norms in crime prevention and criminal justice. In fact, the Commission right now is discussing this agenda item, and I've heard a number of statements that do not necessarily relate specifically to the obligation on hate crime, but there is definitely a link to many of the areas that have been mentioned. My responsibilities cover police reform and victim support, 2 areas that are very closely connected to this work, as well as looking at access to justice for all and equal access to justice for all, which means also addressing discrimination in the criminal justice system and providing services to vulnerable victims or victims at risk of not receiving support by traditional criminal justice systems. Kishan has already mentioned what member states committed to at the Crime Congress in March in Kyoto, Japan, and I won't read it again, but I think it's important to note one of the initial paragraphs of the Kyoto Declaration, which reaffirmed the role of the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime as the leading entity of the United Nations, supporting member states in the field of crime prevention and criminal justice through the provision of technical assistance and capacity building, as well as through its normative work, research and expertise in cooperation with relevant stakeholders, to which we, so this is the member states, endeavor to provide sufficient, stable, and predictable funding. So if you wish, all of what is said is in this paragraph is what UNODC could be doing in the area of hate crime. It is not a new era as such for the UNODC. And in fact, in 2019, the Crime Commission held a thematic debate on this very issue. Where member states did exchange their experience and some of the experts today were also there sharing their experience of addressing crimes motivated by bias and discrimination. I think it's also important to note, in addition to what I already mentioned, that any work in this area would be building on existing programs, addressing aspects such as prevention of violent extremism, victim support, police reform, violence against women and gender-based violence, including femicide, and access to justice programs, And of course, we would be able to rely on the experience of working in this area for the last 30 years as UNODC. I also think it's important to note that this strong mandate in the declaration is very much in line with important Secretary General and UN priorities set in the last 2 years, with in particular the call to action for human rights and a strong statement to address hate speech, hate crime, and as possible leading to atrocities and genocide. So we're looking at issues that are both touching on human rights, development, but also possibly conflict and serious humanitarian crisis. And of course, this also falls within the framework of the commitments of member states under the Sustainable Development Goals, in particular, I would say SDG 16. So what could we do? We could support member states in facilitating expert knowledge exchange to follow up to what happened already at the Crime Commission, and also exchange between policymakers. This could be done at regional level or at global level, or of course at national level. We could work with experts such as those that are here today, and also experts from different regions in the world to develop tools for policymakers, law enforcement, criminal justice professionals, as well as with civil society and victim service providers. We have a strong network in that area already. We could also support member states, much as we do in other crime areas, on data collection and management. And finally, we could support member states upon request, of course, and depending on resources at either regional or national level, through carrying out assessments, providing legislative assistance, institutional assistance, and capacity building. And I think one of the aspects of UNODC's work, which is very specific, is that we work very much at regional level with regional organizations. OSCE and ODIHR are one example, but we also work with many other regional organizations around the world. So this is something that we could explore if there was interest. Our ED has just recently launched the new UNODC strategy, but also specific strategies. One for Africa has been launched, and the new one is coming up for Latin America and the Caribbean. So again, an interregional and regional approach would be beneficial. And that's it from me. That's my email address. And I will now hand over to my colleague, Ales Gyao-Hanek from ODIHR, to continue on this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anna, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining our important event today. I was introduced, so I won't repeat it. I will speak a little bit about the OSCE and ODIHR's work and experience supporting states with implementation of their commitments on hate crime, and I will also use a quick brief PowerPoint for that. I hope everyone can see it well. Anna already mentioned the thematic discussion on hate crime that took place here in Vienna at CCPCJ 2 years ago. At that event, ODIHR said that it's critically important that hate crime is prioritized on an international level. We also encourage the development of a strong international framework addressing hate crime. Now, here we are 2 years down the line, and I think this is precisely what has happened with Kyoto. And I, of course, join others in welcoming the Kyoto Declaration and its quite strong commitments on hate crime. OSCE, many of you will know, is the largest regional security organization. Our 57 participating states adopt commitments by consensus, and ODIHR then works to support states in their implementation. We are also, or have been at least so far, the only international organization that has a specific portfolio and staff devoted specifically to working on hate crime issues. Let's look now at what the main commitments on hate crime in OSCE are. And you can see them on the slide. I should start, of course, with the definition. OSCE commitments define what a hate crime is. It is a criminal offense committed with a bias motive. And they also, and I didn't include that on the slide, they also explain why it's important to address them. Hate crimes, of course, have severe impact on individual victims, but their impact is broader. They are message crimes, and if they are not dealt with properly, that hateful message resonates throughout communities and can lead to escalation and more violence. And this is why the states, OSCE participating states, have committed themselves to do a number of things, some of which you see on the screen, and I won't read the whole list. I think what defines the OSCE commitments and OSCE mandate around hate crimes are probably 3 points. First, that the commitments are quite technical. It's basically a list of tasks for states to implement. Second, that they are broad enough to be flexible and accommodate different national approaches. And a third point, maybe, they do not provide a closed list of protected grounds. These commitments apply to all hate crimes across the board. A lot has been said already about the Kyoto Declaration, so maybe I will just mention that these commitments in Kyoto Declaration, they are not the same, but they are similar, they are complementary, and they are consistent with the OSCE approach and the approach of the commitments. And this is very important because we don't want the UN member states and the OSCE participating states to have, we would like them to have one set of reinforcing commitments rather than two contradictory sets. A little bit about our work. I won't go into too much details, but as was mentioned, we support OSCE participating states on request in doing what they themselves committed to do. Over the years, we've, since 2003, we've developed a number of programs and tools and worked across the region with national partners. We train, we work to improve policies on data collection, we review hate crime laws, work on hate crime victim support, and more. And of course, we also collect information, official statistics and data, but also information about incidents reported by civil society organizations, and republish those at hatecrime.osce.org, where you will also find most of these resources that are publicly available. So these are really just examples what you see on the slides, but I would like to speak a bit about our experience working with the OSCE participating states. We've been doing it for 15 to 20 years now, and in that period, we have seen fundamental progress across the states in awareness and acknowledgement of the problem of hate crime. Needless to say, we recorded numerous good practices and positive examples, positive developments in law enforcement, criminal justice bodies' responses to hate crimes. Civil society also have become more aware, collaborate better with many governments. We have also made progress in coordination with other regional organizations that work on hate crimes, in order to ensure that the international community speaks with one clear voice with our national partners and stakeholders. I should not be the judge of it, but I will immodestly say that ODIHR has played an important role in these improvements, and it was made possible because of what our mandate and commitments on hate crimes are and how they're construed and structured. So to conclude, I think and hope that Kyoto is the first step in a similar direction for UNODC. And I want to welcome UNODC colleagues to the international hate crime community. And just to repeat what Kishan mentioned, ODIHR will be happy to, within bounds of our own mandate, of course, to share experience and expertise and support further work on hate crimes in and by the UN. Thank you for your attention. I will stop sharing the screen. I will also post my email address in the chat so that you can get in touch if you so wish. And I will now pass the floor over to my dear colleague, Yulia Korisheva, who will moderate the panel discussion. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. I'm happy to see a lot of attendees for our event. And so let's go to our panel discussion devoted to the government and civil society responses to hate crimes. And we will also talk a little bit about collaboration. And as mentioned before, We will have three main panelists today, and I'm very happy to introduce them. So we will have Kathleen Coogan, who is the Senior Advisor for Criminal Justice Integration and Gender in the US Department of State's Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs. We will have Paul Junassi, who is currently the hate crime advisor to the National Police Chiefs Council in the United Kingdom. And I'm happy to introduce Robin Sclafani, who is the director of the Brussels-based organization SAGI, a Jewish Contribution to an Inclusive Europe. And we will have two questions to our distinguished panelists, and I will go straight to these questions. So the first question is, could you please elaborate a little bit on what is needed, in your opinion, for robust responses to hate crimes? And maybe you could also talk a little bit on how your programs contribute to it. And if I may ask Kathleen to start.
Thank you, Julia, and thank you, Alice and Anna, for the invitation to join today. The United States strongly condemns bias-motivated crimes, which are frequently referred to as hate crimes. They are intended to intimidate members of vulnerable groups and have the potential to divide societies and create cycles of retaliation and violence. Because they target individuals or groups on the basis of their identity, bias-motivated crimes are particularly insidious. Such crimes pose a challenge to individuals as well as communities and ultimately to society as a whole. The bias motivations for hate crimes may vary, but they exist worldwide. Bias categories covered under US federal hate crimes laws include race, color, national origin, religion, disability, gender, sexual orientation, and gender identity. We vigorously investigate and, as appropriate, prosecute bias-motivated crimes. Approaches to countering bias-motivated crimes should have some common features. First, they should promote accurate reporting and collection of relevant data, which helps authorities take effective steps to counter hate crimes. Accordingly, we support the voluntary implementation of the International Classification of Crime for Statistical Purposes, or the ICCS, which the UN Crime Commission approved in 2015. The ICCS explicitly recognizes the need to track crimes motivated by bias. Ideally, such data would be disaggregated by bias category. Second, laws that address bias-motivated violence should be accompanied by tailored training to help police, prosecutors, judges, and other criminal justice authorities identify, report, investigate, prosecute, and adjudicate hate crimes, and to ensure that all services are trauma-informed so that survivors are not re-traumatized in engaging with the justice system. Moreover, criminal justice actors need to be cognizant of their own bias and how it impacts their work. Joint training of criminal justice practitioners promotes coordination in countering hate crimes. And it is also important to train journalists to accurately and sensitively report bias-motivated crimes. Third, it is critically important that members of vulnerable groups and other members of civil society have confidence in law enforcement and cooperate in their investigations. Building trust is a long-term process. Proactive outreach measures, such as establishing specially trained liaison offices within police departments, can promote greater information sharing to help solve crimes and even to prevent future ones. Ensuring that local communities, including civil society groups, are at the center of any response to violence is essential. Finally, a diverse law enforcement agency that reflects the community it serves can also help to build trust. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kathleen, for sharing the US experience and approach. I guess the participants got a lot of insights from your response. And now I will pass the floor to Paul.
Thank you. So without repeating what Kathleen said, which I would endorse and agree with, there are a few trends that I kind of think are really important. Hate crime in the UK context, we've considered this to be a really important area of criminal justice in its own right. We know from our data that victims suffer more serious psychological harm more commonly when they're subject to targeted crime than crime in general. So it's important in its own right, but it's also important to note how hate crime and hate speech can be precursors to more serious and more widespread violence, such as genocide and terrorism. So seeing this as a preventative measure of more kind of serious widespread crime is really important. So for me, there's a few things that we need to provide as a state to respond to this. So the first is about leadership, and leadership is really important. We need to see clear messaging from officials, from governments, from political actors of all areas, that we respect that right. And the European framework of human rights is really important in the European context to provide those rights. So that leadership is really important. Obviously, the state needs to apply laws, and for us and for many states, reflecting the enhanced harm that hate crime causes is reflected in the enhanced sentencing that the criminal perpetrators can get, which sends a serious message to victims that they will be protected, and perpetrators that they will be treated more harshly when they commit those hate crimes. So then we need things like policy and data collection systems. They need to be in there because obviously we need to understand the levels of tensions and the levels of hate crime. So understanding data is really important, but then supplementing that with information from partners, with an understanding of the nature of tensions that exist in society will help us to deal with it. So one of the things that I think is really important is about a rejection of a hierarchy. This is a universal human right that we all have to live a life free from targeted abuse. And it's not about prioritizing community A over community B, because overtly doing that can actually exacerbate the tensions that cause the hostility in the first place. So for instance, our sexual orientation hate crime would include gay men attacking people for being heterosexual. The fact that it doesn't happen is largely irrelevant. The fact is it's a universal right that everybody shares not to be targeted because of their sexual orientation. So I think some of the things that we can do is in terms of, without repeating what's already been said, one of the issues is about providing the infrastructure for those who play a role in this to be able to operate. So I'll give one example, which I'll put the web address into the chat when I start talking, is we have a thing called True Vision, which is a website that is run by the police. It's had over 2 million people visit its kind of main page. The victims, we see it as a kind of communal place where victims, where professionals can get information, where you can see data, and it allows them to report anonymously if necessary to the police through a secure reporting mechanism. And it receives around about 7,000 or 8,000 hate crimes and hate crime incidents or hate incidents reported per year. So it's really important because it gives a repository for sharing of information for victims groups. And finally, my final point on this part was just about the importance of this not being seen as just a criminal justice response. Criminal justice agencies are really important, but they're not the sole organization to solve this. The importance of education, the importance of organizations like health, understanding the implications and the psychological harm that gets caused by this and the need to address it is really important. But most importantly, and I really can't overstate this, and it leads into Robin's contribution, is about the relationship with civil society. There are always going to be people who distrust the state, who would find it much more comfortable to report to somebody who they have confidence and trust, and that's obviously often a civil society group. And having that relationship and trusted relationship with partners in civil society really is integral to a broad and comprehensive state response, in my view. So back to you, Yulia.
Thank you so much, Paul, for mentioning all the very important points. And yeah, I will pass the floor to Robin. I guess Robin will talk a little bit more about the importance of cooperation and collaboration.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. And it's really an honor to be here. Thank you for this invitation. We are definitely welcoming the Kyoto Declaration and very excited about what can come in the years forward as a result of it. I'm the director of SEIJI, which is a Jewish contribution to an inclusive Europe. It's a 30-year-old European NGO working against all forms of discrimination and hatred, primarily through anti-bias educational responses. We began our journey in hate crime about 10 years ago with a project called Facing Facts after the European Union passed the Framework Decision on Racism and Xenophobia in 2008, criminalizing certain serious forms of racism and xenophobia with an obligation that EU member states would transpose this legislation into national law by 2010. But there was some resistance at national level and a tremendous amount of inconsistency in the way hate crimes were understood and monitored by governments and by the few NGOs who were at that time monitoring and providing victim support. We understood that governments still needed to be convinced of the reality of hate crimes and to recognize them as an escalation of bias and hostility. Facing Facts aim to make hate crimes visible so they can no longer be ignored and better intervention and prevention measures could be developed. The first step was to learn from grassroots experience to identify the minimum standards for quality data collection and victim support, from which we then developed a Train the Trainer program, which brought together Jewish, LGBT, Roma, Muslim, anti-racist, and disability organizations. They learned from each other's experiences, better appreciated the nature of each form of hostility and the specific and common manifestations of hate crimes they faced, which gave more solidarity in terms of advocating for policy changes. In this process, we all came to understand that one of the greatest barriers to improving the recording and response to hate crime was and is the lack of trust which can exist between communities and police. And so the next phase of Facing Facts, we engage closer with law enforcement in joint trainings with NGOs, both offline and online through the Facing Facts online e-learning platform, and consider together the ways to build trust and improve cooperation to make sure that victims get the support and justice they deserve. As law enforcement and governments began to appreciate the important role which NGOs have in supporting victims and recording incidents, NGOs also began to understand that they needed to build their own capacity to provide credible and actionable data to the police. This requires resources though, funding essentially for human resources, for NGOs to function as interlocutors between victim communities and law enforcement. Between 2017 and 2019, we conducted an action research process in 6 EU countries to map the national system of stakeholders involved in hate crime data collection, to identify the strong and weak areas and create new opportunities for better cooperation. Through stakeholder workshops and interviews, we understood very quickly that even amongst government agencies at national level, there can be huge gaps in communication. The hate crime responsible person in the Ministry of Interior and the one in the Ministry of Justice in many cases never met before our stakeholder workshops. They were and still are also huge gaps in terms of cooperation mechanisms in place between specific communities and law enforcement. In particular, this is the case for Muslim, Roma, Black, and migrant communities. In these 6 countries, many new actions were taken as a result of this participatory process that helped to improve cooperation. And we do not have enough time right now to go into detail. But what I can add here is that there needs to be a great emphasis on training and capacity building, both for NGOs to receive reports from victims and provide the support they need, and for police and other law enforcement officials to be able to recognize and investigate bias motivation and to interact respectfully with the communities they serve. A systems approach is needed when building a national infrastructure. The different stakeholders need training and they need to appreciate each other as partners in the system. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robin. And I agree indeed, cooperation and collaboration on all levels is crucial to have this robust response to hate crimes. And actually, my next question fits well into what we have just discussed, is what, in your opinion, can the international community do to support UN member states after Kyoto? Kathleen, if I may ask you to respond.
Sure, thanks, Yulia. And also thanks to Paul and Robin, and building on what each of them has said, I would like to say that, or I'd like to highlight 3 additional considerations for countering bias-motivated violence. First, countering internal bias in criminal justice systems is key to preserving the legitimacy of those systems. The United States works with foreign partners to recognize, prevent, and counter bias and discrimination as key steps to building government legitimacy and promoting inclusive security and justice for all. Implicit and explicit biases within the criminal justice system serve as serious obstacles to justice and could contribute to failures to protect, or even worse, to law enforcement officers perpetrating bias-motivated crimes and abuse. In our foreign assistance work, we support police oversight and accountability mechanisms. On his first day in office, President Biden issued an executive order on advancing racial equity and support for underserved communities through the federal government, which, in recognition of the unbearable human costs of systemic racism, challenged the United States to embark on an ambitious whole-of-government equity agenda that matches the scale of the opportunities and challenges that we face. Second, as part of legal reform processes, it is important to eliminate laws that legalize or promote bias and discrimination. Members of vulnerable groups need to feel safe coming forward to report bias-motivated violence. Discriminatory laws, such as those that criminalize lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and intersex, or LGBTQI+ status or conduct, will prevent sexual and gender minorities from coming forward. President Biden's memorandum on advancing the human rights of LGBTQI+ persons around the world directs the Department of State to strengthen existing efforts to combat the criminalization by foreign governments of LGBTQI+ status or conduct. Third, thoughtful responses to legal bias-motivated speech could help prevent bias-motivated crimes. In the United States, hate speech, like other speech, is generally protected by the First Amendment, but we can prosecute threats that rise to the level of a true threat or speech that is an incitement to an imminent criminal act. And we can support law enforcement learning, for example, how to respond to bias-motivated speech, even if it does not rise to the level of a criminal offense, with the goal of defusing a potentially dangerous situation. The United States recognizes that no one country has all the answers. Addressing bias and discrimination in all forms requires the global community, including governmental and non-governmental organizations, to come together to work on sustainable solutions. Thank you again for the opportunity. Yulia, back to you.
Thank you so much, Kathleen. And I would like to highlight about the sustainable solutions. I think this is key in what you have just described. Thank you, Kathleen. And now the floor is yours, Paul.
Thank you. I'll be brief. I think what the international actors can do is support states at the time of need. And the time of need, when we look at those countries that have succeeded in addressing this issue, will come from many different triggers. And I think spotting those triggers and being ready to assist when states are willing and able and motivated to put in adequate systems is really important. And we've seen examples from European international organizations like the OSCE, like the Council of Europe, of supporting states. And those triggers can be broad. They can be anything from kind of an international court ruling about a failure to protect rights. It can be about a tragedy. It can be about a conflict. Or it could be about a political decision to address issues more robustly. And I think then being in a position as international governments to share good practice, to assist with training methodologies that work, to be able to monitor progress against international standards is really important. And I think what I'd leave with is kind of one call, which I think is been significantly better in recent years than sort of in previous times, is about international government organizations having common standards, about having similar approaches, about being complementary, rather than going off in different directions. And I think IGOs have been significantly better at that in the last decade or so, and maintaining that consistent standard and working alongside each other for a common good is a really important message to show leadership to states who are looking to address these issues.
Thank you so much, Paul. Robin?
Yeah, thank you. Well, from the research we've done in Facing Facts and the systems mapping, it was really clear that international government organizations have an absolutely tremendous role to play in supporting national policy and practice. In particular, they've provided essential support to those people within government agencies who are the engines of change. Often in the beginning of developing national policy, there are only 1 or 2 people appointed to hate crime, and they can feel isolated and face resistance inside their own agencies to addressing the hate factor in hate crime. The exchanges with colleagues in Transnational Forum has created an international community of practice that gives energy, ideas, training, and resources that are not often available at national level. The other thing that we've noticed in reviewing the international normative framework is that the standards often focus on individual agencies, such as police or prosecution, and very few focus on the cooperation across these institutions and with NGOs, who should be equal partner in the systems. So it's worthwhile also to note that there's currently little or no practice in terms of training needs assessment and evaluation. These are 2 other areas the international community can provide support to national governments. And finally, the political wins can have a huge impact on the civil servants who are implementing hate crime policy. It is essential for the international community to hold elected governments accountable to their international commitments in this area. At CEGI, we say, some people change because they see the light, and others because they feel the heat. The international community can help bring both light and heat to this effort. Thanks again for this chance.
Thank you so much, Robin, and thank you actually everyone, Kathleen, Paul as well. I think we managed to cover the key points. Obviously, we'll take into account the time limitations. I know you all have much more to say, but I guess now we will go to the question and answer session, because I can see we have few questions in our Q&A chat. So let me read out one of the questions. Here, I guess this is the question to all our speakers today. And here's the question. What, if any, contribution can hate crime laws and the international organizations' initiatives make to dealing with structures of exclusion based on discrimination when government austerity initiatives have brought criminal justice to a state of crisis? I wonder if someone would like to answer. I know it's not the easiest question, but if we have any volunteers, and maybe I will put this question to the panelists into a chat so that you would see it.
Okay, I'm happy to address it because the question specifically talks about the UK, and the UK has taken austerity measures after the 2008 financial crisis, and it would be wrong to suggest that hasn't had an impact. The money that came from local government and from local agencies to support the networks in the towns and the cities, it's been more difficult for those charities and those groups to get. I think we have actually seen significant success in the reporting of hate crime. When we compare recorded crime with the crime survey estimate, we've seen a significant increase from around 1 in 6 hate crimes being recorded by the police to 1 in 2. So actually, we have seen some progress, but that's not to say that those communities aren't less affected. Some, like people in the audience representing organisations like Tamama and the CST, have been fantastically successful on a national basis, but it doesn't stretch into the Hindu community and the Sikh community and the transgender communities. And I think we have to obviously cut the cloth to what we've got. But it would be wrong to suggest that we couldn't do more if we could offer more money to civil society to support those local structures. But I guess we have to work with what we have.
Thank you, Paul. I can see Alish, your hand. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Julia. I think it's a very good question, and I won't be speaking about any state in particular, but to give an IGO type of answer. So of course, hate crime is only a small aspect of racism and broader problems around it. And I can only speak for hate crimes, in fact, but hate crime laws and the work we do, hate crime laws in particular, they are an anti-racism tool as such. And if this question is about structural racism and having racist governments, and does it make sense to even address hate crime in this context? My answer is yes. Hate crime laws are a tool for combating racism. Now, all the states have some anti-racism or some hate crime laws, and the question is, are those implemented? And in that respect, and I think our panelists have confirmed it in their contributions, the IGOs do have a role to play. I heard a mention of agents of change. Even in the most hostile of environments, there are always people who want to do the right thing. And if the efforts of the international organizations are directed well, we can really make a difference and contribute to dismantling of those discriminatory structures.
Yes, Robin, I can see your hand. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I mean, we work with a concept called the pyramid of hate, which is really important here, where you have bias and stereotypes at the bottom, and then you have acts of prejudice, discrimination, so institutional discrimination, and then you have violence above that, which is where hate crimes is, and of course genocide is at the top of this pyramid of hate. And it's really important to see these as the building blocks. So hate crime legislation and recording those incidents is an indicator of the hostility which exists in the society, right? That's escalated to such a point in which violence and crimes occur. So in terms of shedding light on how deep is the problem in society, in that sense, hate crime monitoring and legislation is really, really important. The other thing is that for police to be able to respond appropriately, they have to understand the nature of each type of hostility, right? This is what we talk about bias indicators, the indicators of the bias motivation that they need to look at when investigating a crime. So the training of police in hate crimes also raises awareness and understanding about how this hatred is functioning and the mechanism from biases up through. And hopefully inside that training, they're also, as Kathleen talked about, also so wisely, they're looking inside themselves and being aware of their own implicit biases.
Thank you so much. I absolutely agree. And I just wanted to thank all the panelists for your very valuable contributions. And I hope that the attendees, the participants of the event learned a lot from you. And I just wanted to highlight that indeed, cooperation, collaboration, and training, education, leadership, building capacity, data collection, all of these things need to be improved, need to be done in order to have this comprehensive and robust response to hate crimes. Unfortunately, we do not have much time for any other questions, so I will pass the floor to Kishan Manocha for the closing remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you to everyone who has spoken with such clarity and insight based on huge experience at today's side event. I'm really impressed at how much we have covered in such a short space of time. I think it speaks to the impressive understanding that you have of this phenomenon of hate crime and all that it represents, all that it challenges in terms of our concerted, systematic efforts to defeat it, to eradicate it. And therefore, there could not be a more important moment for a robust international framework, which within which member states, including participating states of the OSCE, can play a key and leading role. And I take Paul's point about leadership, political will, and the fact that ultimately, as we know in the OSCE, commitments are only as good as the implementation that follows. Otherwise, they are words on a piece of paper or online somewhere. But anyway, I just want to thank everyone who's contributed. Time does not permit a more thorough summary of today's events. You've heard it all for yourself. As UNODC, as UN member states take this very important framework forward, ODIHR, as we've heard from Alish, stands ready to support it to the extent that we can. There is an incredible amount of learning and experience around addressing hate crimes. We've heard a lot of it today. So it's a good time to have this framework in place. It can be supported by the excellent work that goes on and more work that needs to, of course, go on. So thank you to Anna, thank you to our UNODC friends and colleagues. Thank you to my dear colleagues, Alish and Yulia, to Nina for the logistical support today, our panelists, Kathleen, Robin, and Paul, and thanks to all of you for attending. Thank you. Have a good rest of the day.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Oh, yes, it's this 210 actually.